In a sepia photograph taken around 1906, the mansion on what is now 525 South Winchester Boulevard in San Jose, California, stands at its most bewildering. 2 decades have passed since construction began in 1886 on the house that California's landmark register would later describe simply as a 160-room Victorian mansion, continuously expanded until Sarah Winchester's death in 1922. In the image, afternoon light slides across carved woodwork in the grand ballroom, catching teak, maple, and mahogany in a pattern so intricate it reads like a diagram of wealth itself. Nearby, a shallow staircase climbs with 44 gentle steps to gain barely 3 meters, built to spare an arthritic owner, yet later treated as an omen. Behind the glass, the house is all ambition: art glass, imported fittings, unbroken facades. Outside the frame lie earthquakes, auctions, and stories she never told. The photograph fixes the mansion as eternal. History will not. Early autumn in 1881 brought two certainties to Sarah Lockwood Pardee Winchester's life in New Haven, Connecticut: the death of her husband, William Wirt, from tuberculosis, and an inheritance that would define her remaining decades. The probate records show she received approximately 50% of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company and an income from dividends that, while substantial, never approached the mythical 1,000 a day later biographers would claim. She was 41 years old, 15 years past the death of her infant daughter Annie, and already acquainted with the architecture of grief, the New Haven brownstone on Prospect Hill that she and William had commissioned together, its heavy drapes and echoing stairwells a testament to their shared interest in interiors and design. The New Haven house had taught her something about domestic space and personal agency. Victorian women of wealth were expected to manage households, but rarely to design them. Sarah and William had worked directly with their architect, making decisions about room placement, window proportions, and the quality of wood paneling in the library. She learned the language of construction: joists and headers, load-bearing walls and decorative facades, the difference between structural necessity and aesthetic choice. This education, informal but thorough, would prove essential in California. By 1885, after several family members died in close succession, Sarah followed documented medical advice common to her era: move west for the climate. California newspapers advertised the therapeutic properties of dry air and sunshine for those with respiratory ailments and chronic pain. Arthritis had already begun limiting her mobility. New England winters aggravated the condition. She traveled to San Francisco, stayed with relatives, and eventually made her way south to the Santa Clara Valley, where fruit orchards stretched in geometric rows and land still sold for reasonable prices. The valley's agricultural boom was creating fortunes in dried fruit and canning. Real estate speculators were subdividing former Mexican land grants into suburban estates. It was a landscape of transformation where money could still buy privacy. The famous story of a Boston medium named Adam Coons, instructing her to build continuously to appease gun-violent spirits, appears in no record before 1967, when writer Susie Smith introduced the tale in Prominent American Ghosts. Historians have searched exhaustively for any evidence of this seance or this medium. None exists. No spiritualist directories, no newspaper advertisements for seances, no mention in the extensive archives of American spiritualism from the 1880s. The story emerged 8 decades after Sarah's alleged consultation, without source, without verification, without any documentary trail. What does exist? County records showing Sarah Winchester's purchase in 1886 of an 8-room farmhouse and several acres of land on the outskirts of San Jose, a property she would name La Nada Villa. The structure was simple, serviceable: clapboard walls, a central staircase, wide verandas facing orchards. In photographs from that year, the house appears modest, almost retiring, framed by rows of fruit trees that recede into the valley haze. The surrounding land included mature orchards producing apricots and prunes, income generating while she decided what to build. The farmhouse itself had been constructed in the 1850s, typical of early American settlement architecture in California: functional, unpretentious, designed for a climate that was generous compared to northern winters. But Sarah had learned something during her years in New Haven, that wealth combined with will could reshape domestic space into something both functional and entirely personal. She hired local builders, consulted at least 2 architects, then dismissed them. What she wanted, it seemed, was not a finished plan, but an ongoing conversation with possibility. The architects, trained in conventional practice, offered complete designs, elevations, floor plans, specifications. Sarah apparently wanted something more fluid, more responsive to her evolving needs and ideas. The dismissals weren't hostile. They simply reflected incompatible approaches to how buildings come into being. By the time census records locate her firmly at the San Jose property, construction had already begun. Wings appeared, then upper stories, then towers that neighbors would later recall being altered and rebuilt. The easy riser staircase made its first appearance during these early years, carpenters experimenting with Sarah's request for steps shallow enough to spare her arthritis, each riser built at half the standard height. The result, 44 steps, climbing what an ordinary staircase would accomplish in 22. To the men who built it, the design was simply humane, an accommodation requested by the woman paying their wages. To later storytellers, it would become evidence of something darker, a fear of heights, a terror of ascending too quickly toward heaven, a mathematical incantation against death itself. But in 1887, it was just carpentry, wood cut to specific dimensions, assembled with care, serving a medical need with architectural grace. The 1890s brought vertical ambition to La Nada Villa. Where the original farmhouse had maintained a polite 2-story profile, new construction added turrets, dormers, and eventually a 7-story tower that became visible from the downtown streets of San Jose. Tax assessments reflected the growing built value. What began as a modest farmhouse was assessed by 1895 as a sprawling Victorian estate worth tens of thousands of dollars. The architecture followed no single style, but borrowed liberally from the pattern books of the era: steep Gothic roofs, Romanesque arches, Queen Anne turrets, Eastlake ornamental brackets. It was an architectural bricolage typical of late Victorian taste, which valued eclecticism and ornamental richness over classical unity. Materials arrived by freight, redwood framing from Northern California mills, where old-growth trees yielded timbers of astonishing dimension and resistance to rot. Lincrusta wall coverings from England that imitated pressed leather and embossed metal, providing texture and visual interest to interior walls without the expense of actual metalwork. Beveled glass panels, brass hardware polished to mirror brightness, carved mahogany for banisters and newel posts. The invoices, preserved in county archives, document a steady flow of high-quality materials, not the extravagance of East Coast Gilded Age palaces, but solid, expensive craftsmanship nonetheless. The construction proceeded in bursts rather than continuously, a fact that later historian Mary Jo Ignafo would establish through careful examination of building permits, material invoices, and newspaper mentions. The legend of 38 years of round-the-clock construction collapses under documentary scrutiny. Work paused for Sarah's health, for financial planning, for simple decision-making. Carpenters were hired for specific projects, then dismissed when the work was complete. Months might pass with only maintenance and repair, no expansion. Then another wing would begin, another set of rooms, another tower. The pattern was episodic, not relentless. But when construction resumed, it did so with evident purpose. Rooms grew from rooms, hallways connected to other hallways in patterns that made sense during construction, but would later seem labyrinthine once earthquake damage closed off sections and created architectural dead ends. The house expanded like a living thing, adding chambers according to need rather than predetermined design. This organic approach created both the mansion's distinctive character and its eventual reputation for confusion. A house built all at once from a single plan reads as unified. A house built piecemeal over decades, responding to changing needs and ideas, reads as maze. The easy riser staircase became one of several circulation experiments. A house growing by accretion rather than master plan creates challenges. How to connect a new wing to an existing structure when floor levels don't quite match. The result, Stairs that climbed, turned, descended slightly, then climbed again. Doors that once opened to gardens found themselves opening to second-floor walls after new construction rose around them. These weren't mysteries planned in advance. They were the inevitable result of building continuously without demolishing what already existed. Each addition had to negotiate with what was already there, creating compromises in elevation, circulation, and spatial logic. By the mid-1890s, the San Francisco Chronicle had begun noticing the project. On February 24, 1895, the paper published what appears to be the earliest written suggestion that Sarah was building to forestall death, a story presented without attribution to any source, floating free of verification. The article described her estate as unusual and sprawling, a house perpetually under construction. Whether the reporter interviewed neighbors, servants, or simply observed from the road remains unclear. The piece had the tone of society column gossip translated into architectural speculation, full of dramatic suggestion but empty of concrete detail. But the seed was planted. A wealthy widow, building endlessly, might be running from something. The house itself, silent behind its fences and orchards, offered no rebuttal. Sarah granted no interviews, issued no clarifications, refused engagement with public curiosity. This silence, whether chosen as privacy, imposed by shyness, or reflecting her class's disdain for publicity, created the vacuum that speculation rushed to fill. In the absence of Sarah's own explanation, she granted no interviews, wrote no memoir, left no diary explaining her intentions. Speculation rushed in to fill the silence. The house became a story told by others, shaped by Victorian-era assumptions about widows, wealth, and women who refused to socialize. That it was also a remarkable feat of sustained private construction, employing dozens of craftsmen for years and creating one of California's most distinctive residential buildings, seemed less interesting than the question of why. The architecture itself, with its real innovations in accessibility and its genuine aesthetic achievements, disappeared beneath the narrative of supernatural compulsion. The turn of the century found Lanada Villa at its most elaborate. The Historic American Building Survey would later document 160 rooms, though the exact count depended on how one defined room. Did small storage spaces count, enclosed landings, servants' quarters, conservatories? The ambiguity itself revealed something about the house. It had grown beyond conventional categorization. The grand ballroom alone, with its hand-carved wood paneling in teak, maple, and mahogany, its German silver chandeliers hanging from ornamental ceiling medallions, and its floor-to-ceiling art glass windows, represented years of artisan labor. The patterns in the parquet floors repeated geometric motifs found in the ceiling medallions, a visual echo that suggested careful aesthetic planning despite the lack of a master blueprint. Someone was thinking about proportion, rhythm, visual harmony, even if that someone was revising continuously rather than working from a fixed design. Sarah's daily life proceeded through these spaces with a quiet routine. Staff remembered her as practical and financially shrewd, a woman who paid attention to account books and household management. She rose early, breakfast in rooms that caught morning light, spent hours at her desk managing Winchester Company dividends and real estate investments. She maintained multiple sitting rooms and bedrooms, moving between them seasonally or according to mood, a summer bedroom facing north to catch cool breezes, a winter bedroom with southern exposure and thick carpets. The Lincrusta wall coverings, embossed and painted to resemble pressed metal or tooled leather, provided texture and warmth to rooms that might otherwise feel cavernous. Running a hand along these walls, you encountered ridges and valleys, surfaces that responded to touch with subtle topography. An indoor garden featured sloping floors inset with trapdoors designed for drainage, a practical solution presented in later tours as occult symbolism. The garden space allowed Sarah to cultivate plants year-round, sheltered from frost but receiving ample natural light through glass roof panels. The trapdoors opened onto brick channels that carried excess water away from the foundation, essential in a climate where winter rains could be intense. Victorian indoor gardens, popular among the wealthy, required such engineering. Water had to go somewhere. The mystical interpretation came later, imposed by tour guides who needed every architectural feature to carry supernatural significance. The Easy Riser staircase appeared now as part of the house's documented accessibility features, though that term wouldn't enter common usage for nearly a century. Sarah's arthritis, which had prompted her move west, had not disappeared. California's dry climate eased, but didn't eliminate joint pain and stiffness. The shallow steps allowed her to navigate between floors without the strain of standard staircases. She could climb slowly, pausing at landings to rest if needed, her weight supported by smooth mahogany handrails installed at exactly the right height. For servants and visitors with full mobility, steeper backstairs provided quicker routes, evidence that the house accommodated different bodies, different needs, rather than imposing a single circulation pattern on all occupants. Elsewhere, innovation merged with Victorian taste, push-button gas lights that could be operated without reaching for overhead, fixtures, multiple indoor bathrooms with hot running water supplied by a sophisticated boiler system, forced air heating distributed through floor registers, an annunciator system allowing Sarah to summon servants from any room by pressing buttons that rang bells in the kitchen and servants' quarters. These were cutting-edge domestic technologies in 1900, the kind of features wealthy East Coast mansions advertised proudly in society columns and architectural journals. But because Sarah didn't advertise, because she received almost no visitors outside family and staff, these details remained largely invisible to the public eye. The house was modern in ways that contradicted its later reputation as a Gothic throwback. What the public saw instead were the tower silhouettes rising above orchard trees, the sound of hammers in the morning, the steady arrival of material wagons along the county road. The 1897 San Jose News reported that Sarah had ordered the 7-story tower torn down and rebuilt multiple times, each iteration apparently dissatisfying her. Whether this reflected structural concerns after minor earthquakes that regularly rattled the region, aesthetic revision as she reconsidered proportions and details, or simple restlessness with fixed forms remains unknown. The tower that survived until the 1906 earthquake bore no explanatory plaque, no architect's signature, no indication of its meaning to the woman who commissioned its repeated construction. By 1905, approximately 2 decades into the project, La Nada Villa had become both a private residence and a public curiosity, a house that newspapers mentioned but few had entered, that neighbors speculated about but couldn't quite explain. In an era when wealthy women were expected to host elaborate dinners, to maintain social calendars, to justify their presence through cultural performance and philanthropic display, Sarah Winchester's retreat into self-designed space read as either tragedy or defiance. She attended no society events, hosted no charity galas, appeared in no social registers. The house itself remained neutral, rising toward the earthquake that would finally edit its ambitions with geological authority. The ballroom stood ready for guests who never arrived. German chandeliers hung from a ceiling inlaid with carved wooden medallions, each one unique, casting soft light across parquet floors where teak, maple, and mahogany formed interlocking geometric patterns that seemed to shift depending on viewing angle and time of day. Hand-carved wood paneling rose 12 feet to meet ornamental crown molding, every surface bearing evidence of sustained artisan attention, the kind of work that required days per panel, where chisels followed penciled patterns with surgical precision. Art glass windows, some imported from European workshops, some commissioned from local craftsmen in San Francisco, filtered California sunlight into colors that shifted through the day: morning amber, afternoon rose, evening indigo. The room could have hosted 100 dancers, a full orchestra, the kind of society event that defined Gilded Age social hierarchies. Instead, it hosted Sarah Winchester and her piano, the occasional servant dusting surfaces, and eventually the earthquake cracks that would spider across its northern wall, like proof that even the most carefully built spaces remain subject to forces beyond control. The ballroom represented Victorian aesthetic philosophy at its most elaborate. The idea that beauty resided in accumulation, in layered ornamentation, in surfaces so densely worked that the eye could wander for hours without exhausting visual interest. Every ceiling medallion bore a different floral or geometric motif. Every panel of floor parquetry presented a distinct pattern. The chandeliers themselves, imported from Germany where such work represented centuries of metalworking tradition, combined silver plating with crystal prisms that fractured light into additional layers of visual complexity. This was beauty as labor, as the visible accumulation of human hours, as wealth translated directly into craft. Elsewhere in the house, Lincrusta wall coverings pressed with floral and geometric patterns lined bedroom walls, painted to mimic materials more expensive than they were: copper, tooled leather, hammered silver. The texture under fingertips read as luxury, as deliberate beauty, as care taken in spaces only Sarah and her staff would regularly see. Lincrusta, a Victorian invention combining linseed oil, wood flour, and rosin pressed into relief patterns, offered middle-class households affordable approximations of aristocratic surfaces. For Sarah Winchester, who could afford actual metalwork and leather, the choice suggested appreciation for the material's own aesthetic qualities rather than its cost-saving function. In one bedroom, a sitting area adjoined a sewing room, both opening onto a small conservatory where morning light pooled. The configuration suggested a woman who spent long hours indoors, moving between creative tasks, sewing, reading, correspondence, piano practice, seeking varied light and spatial experience within the boundaries of her property. The sewing room contained a treadle machine, fabric storage, a cutting table positioned to catch north light that wouldn't fade colors. These were the working spaces of a woman who made things with her hands, who understood materials and their properties, who found satisfaction in process as well as product. The indoor garden occupied a ground floor space with a sloped floor and multiple trap doors set flush with the tile. Later tour guides would present these doors as spirit traps or architectural mysteries, evidence of Sarah's obsessive efforts to confuse ghosts who might navigate by level surfaces. The Historic American Buildings Survey documentation notes their actual function: drainage. The garden's plants required regular watering, excess water needed somewhere to go. In an era before modern waterproofing membranes and sophisticated moisture barriers, sloped floors and drainage ports were practical solutions to moisture management. The trapdoors opened onto brick channels that directed water away from the foundation, protecting the structure from rot and settling. Occult symbolism had nothing to do with it, just Victorian engineering solving a straightforward problem. The easy riser staircase appeared throughout these interior spaces, not just the famous 44-step example, but variations adapted to different connections between floors and wings. Each maintained the principle: shallow risers, frequent landings, handholds always within reach. For a woman whose body had begun resisting standard stairs, these accommodations meant independence. She could move through her house without assistance, without the pain that would otherwise confine her to a single floor, without surrendering mobility to age and arthritis. That this innovation later became fodder for ghost stories, proof that Sarah feared ascending to heaven, or that she built stairs deliberately confusing to trap spirits, reveals more about cultural attitudes toward disability and architectural accommodation than about Sarah Winchester's intentions. Servants navigated different routes: steeper back stairs, narrower hallways, plainer finishes. The house maintained Victorian-era distinctions between spaces for family and spaces for staff, though Sarah's household remained small compared to East Coast estates of similar square footage. A cook, housekeepers, groundskeepers, occasional carpenters for repairs and minor alterations. They remembered her in later oral histories collected by preservationists and local historians as exacting but fair, a woman who knew what she wanted and paid promptly. She expected competence, rewarded loyalty, and maintained the emotional distance typical of employer-servant relationships in her era. None mentioned ghosts, none mentioned seances, none described midnight construction sessions or spiritualist consultations. What they described was a wealthy woman managing a large, complex house with the same attention to detail she applied to its construction: methodical, informed, in control. The first newspaper story suggesting supernatural motivation appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle on February 24, 1895. The article claimed Sarah was building to avoid death, though it cited no source for this assertion, no interview, No overheard conversation, no document, no named informant. The story circulated nonetheless, finding receptive audiences in a culture already fascinated by spiritualism, haunted houses, and the Gothic possibilities of Victorian architecture. The late 19th century was spiritualism's golden age in America. Seances were fashionable entertainment, mediums performed in theaters, and the boundary between living and dead seemed tantalizingly permeable to those seeking contact with lost loved ones. Sarah Winchester, as a wealthy widow who had lost both husband and child, fit the cultural archetype perfectly. By 1900, the mystery house epithet had begun appearing in local papers, describing a mansion perpetually under construction, owned by a reclusive widow who never explained herself. The name wasn't official. Sarah never called it that. County records listed it under variations of Lanada Villa or simply Winchester property, but newspapers needed shorthand. Mystery house conveyed everything. The architectural oddity, the owner's reclusiveness, the hint of supernatural activity, the Gothic appeal that sold papers to readers hungry for local color and strange tales. The 1897 San Jose news piece about the seven-story tower being rebuilt multiple times added architectural eccentricity to the growing narrative. Neighbors interviewed decades later recalled the tower's distinctive silhouette, visible from downtown streets several miles away, and the scaffolding that seemed to perpetually surround it. The tower rose, was partially dismantled, and rose again in modified form. Whether Sarah ordered the rebuilds due to structural instability, the Santa Clara Valley experienced regular minor earthquakes that might reveal weaknesses, aesthetic dissatisfaction with proportions or details, or simply because she could, remains undocumented. What the newspapers captured was the public face of private revision, a structure rising, falling, rising again, its purposes known only to the woman who commissioned it and paid for each iteration. The easy riser staircase entered print as one of the house's oddities, though early reporters seemed uncertain whether to classify it as an engineering curiosity or evidence of deeper strangeness. That it served a documented medical need, easing arthritic joints, reducing pain, enabling an aging woman to maintain independence, interested journalists less than its violation of normative proportions. A staircase should rise efficiently, gaining maximum height in minimum horizontal distance. This one meandered, taking twice the space to accomplish what standard construction did routinely. That the meander served function, that it represented thoughtful accommodation of bodily limitation, was beside the point. Architectural deviation, in the hands of a woman who wouldn't explain herself, became proof of architectural madness. What Sarah thought of these stories, if she read them, remains unknown. She gave no interviews to correct the record, issued no statements clarifying her intentions, and responded to no inquiries from curious journalists. She maintained no press relations, employed no publicist, made no effort to shape public perception. This silence, whether chosen as privacy, imposed by shyness, or simply reflecting her class's disdain for publicity, created a narrative vacuum. The culture of 1900 filled that vacuum with ghost stories, spiritualist intrigue, and Gothic speculation. A woman building alone must be building for the dead, the logic went. A widow with wealth and grief must be driven by guilt over the source of her fortune. That she might simply be exercising the architectural agency her wealth allowed, that she might find satisfaction in design and continuous revision, that she might prefer her own company to society's demands. These explanations lacked narrative appeal. They were too ordinary, too rational, too respectful of female autonomy in an era that preferred women to be either angels or madwomen, victims or villains. The newspapers needed mystery. The mansion's growing room count, its irregular footprint, its towers and turrets and unexplained windows all provided raw material for Gothic storytelling in an era hungry for sensation. By the time Lanada Villa entered its third decade of construction, its meaning had already been written by people who had never entered it, who knew nothing of Sarah Winchester's actual daily life, who projected onto her silence whatever their imaginations required. The house became less a building than a story, and stories, once established in public consciousness, prove harder to demolish than any architecture. The physical structure could be measured, photographed, documented, but the narrative structure surrounding it had already achieved a kind of permanence that no amount of factual correction would dislodge. Doors opening to walls, windows barred from inside, staircases climbing to ceilings. These architectural peculiarities appear in every tour brochure, every documentary, every Halloween special about the Winchester Mystery House. The historic American Building Survey documentation, completed decades after Sarah's death by teams of architects and preservationists trained in systematic building analysis, cataloged each anomaly with measured precision. Doors at X location opening to Y foot drop, windows at Z coordinates facing interior walls, stairs terminating at ceiling level. What the documentation also notes, though tour narratives often omit, are the explanations grounded in construction history and earthquake damage rather than supernatural intention. The door opening to a drop originally led to a second-floor porch or external stairway providing access to gardens below. Earthquake damage in 1906 collapsed the porch structure. Sarah chose to seal the exterior opening rather than rebuild, leaving the door in place as a now functionless remnant. Removing the door would have required dismantling the surrounding frame and wall, possibly destabilizing adjacent structure. Easier to simply lock it, to treat it as an architectural fossil. The barred interior windows, once exterior, facing orchard views and valley vistas. New construction added wings around them. What was outside became inside. What had been a view transformed into a wall. The bars remained because removal would damage delicate woodwork and glazing, and because interior bars posed no functional problem. The staircase to the ceiling, built before the ceiling, intended to access a planned but never completed second floor in that section. Abandoning the upper floor, perhaps due to changed needs, structural concerns, or simple revision of intent, left the stairs stranded, climbing toward plaster that shouldn't have been there. These weren't mysteries planned in advance. They were the inevitable result of continuous construction without demolition, of building around rather than rebuilding, of accumulation creating contradiction. These rational explanations emerge from architectural analysis, from understanding how continuous construction without comprehensive demolition creates spatial puzzles. When you build around what exists rather than clearing ground for unified design, you trap earlier architectural decisions inside later ones. Former exteriors become interiors. Circulation routes intended for one-floor plans survive into incompatible revisions. Structural elements designed for never-realized additions remain as fragments. The house becomes a palimpsest, each layer preserving traces of previous intentions, each revision creating new relationships between elements that were never designed to coexist. But rationality serves tourism poorly, especially horror-themed tourism in an industry that thrives on supernatural narrative. The trapdoors in the indoor garden become spirit drains, channels through which malevolent ghosts can be flushed from the house. The switchback hallways become confusion tactics against spirits who supposedly can only travel in straight lines. The easy riser staircase becomes evidence that Sarah feared climbing to heaven too quickly, that she needed to slow her ascent, to delay whatever judgment awaited her for profiting from weapon manufacture. Every practical choice is retrofitted with supernatural purpose, and generations of guides repeat the revised narrative because it sells tickets, because it matches visitor expectations, because the house's real history, complex, undramatic, rooted in arthritis and earthquake damage, lacks the narrative punch of ghost stories. Some guides, interviewed decades later by historians and journalists investigating the gap between legend and fact, expressed discomfort with the fabrications. They knew neighbors who remembered Sarah as practical and sharp, not addled and fearful. They understood that the architectural oddities had rational explanations. But the script was the script, and employment required following it. The house had become a stage where performers delivered lines written by others, where historical accuracy mattered less than audience satisfaction and ticket revenue. The transformation of the easy riser staircase from accessibility feature to a cult symbol encapsulates the process. Documents prove Sarah suffered from arthritis, medical records, letters mentioning her limited mobility, family reminiscences. Photographs show her at advanced ages, looking frail, using a cane, moving carefully. Building codes from the era offer no restrictions on staircase proportions. She was free to design for comfort, to commission stairs built to her body's specific needs. Yet the 44 shallow steps become, in tourist tellings, a magical number. 4 multiplied by 11, mystical in their geometry, proof of communication with the dead, evidence of numerological obsession tied to spiritualist practice. The stairs still rise as they always did, in careful increments calibrated to an aging woman's joints. The wood is real, the construction documented, the medical need established by multiple sources. But meaning has been poured over them like varnish, obscuring the grain underneath, transforming accessibility into supernatural theater. The most persistent myth took shape decades after Sarah Winchester's death, crystallized by Susie Smith in her 1967 book, Prominent American Ghosts. The story achieved its canonical form. A Boston medium named Adam Coons told Sarah that she must move west and build continuously to appease spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles. Stop building, and she would die. The curse could only be managed, never lifted. The narrative had everything: guilt over weapons manufacture, ghosts seeking vengeance, a wealthy woman driven by supernatural command rather than rational choice, and the satisfying moral lesson that fortunes built on violence inevitably extract psychological cost. Historians have searched exhaustively for Adam Coons. Census records, city directories, spiritualist association registries, newspaper advertisements for seances and medium services, membership lists from spiritualist churches, even birth and death records. Nothing. No medium by that name practiced in Boston during the 1880s when Sarah allegedly received this counsel. No records place Sarah Winchester at any documented seance in Boston, San Francisco, or San Jose. The extensive archives of American spiritualism from this period, preserved in university collections and historical societies, contain no mention of either Adam Coons or Sarah Winchester as seance participants. The entire foundational story of the house rests on a single 1967 book citation, offered without primary source documentation, emerging 85 years after the alleged event. Susie Smith provided no evidence beyond the story itself: no letters, no diaries, no contemporary newspaper accounts, no witnesses. Later researchers attempting to verify the tale found only other books citing Smith's book, a circular reference pattern that substituted repetition for verification. Mary Jo Ignafo, who has studied Sarah Winchester's life more thoroughly than any other historian, spending years in archives examining financial records, correspondence, legal documents, and contemporary newspaper coverage, traces how the myth evolved through distinct phases. Early newspaper speculation about building to avoid death, appearing as early as 1895, provided the seed. This speculation remained vague, suggesting superstition without specifying its source. Over decades of retelling, through feature articles and local color pieces, and eventually tourist brochures, the generic building to avoid death transformed into specific seance instructions. The location Boston added geographic specificity and cultural weight. Boston as the home of refined spiritualist practice versus California as a provincial frontier. The medium acquired a name, Adam Coons, only in 1967, 3/4 of a century after he supposedly delivered his warnings. Each retelling added detail that earlier versions lacked. The number 13 gained mystical significance in 1920s tour scripts, despite having no special prominence in the original architecture. The spiderweb window, an art glass panel featuring a geometric pattern, became a spirit communication device in post-World War II narratives. Ordinary building features like multiple doorways and service stairs were recast as occult apparatus designed to confuse pursuing ghosts. By the time the house became a major tourist attraction in the mid-20th century, the supernatural narrative had ossified into apparent fact, repeated so consistently that it acquired the weight of truth through sheer repetition. The irony cuts deep. Neighbors, staff, and relatives who knew Sarah consistently described her as clear-headed, financially astute, and private rather than strange or superstitious. She managed her Winchester Company dividends carefully, tracking stock prices and dividend payments with the attention of a sophisticated investor. She maintained property investments beyond the San Jose house, parcels in San Francisco, shares in local utilities, bonds and securities carefully balanced for income and risk. She corresponded regularly with attorneys and accountants, discussing tax strategies and estate planning. Her surviving business letters, preserved in legal archives, demonstrate sharp financial intelligence and long-term planning inconsistent with someone terrorized by supernatural forces. None of this matches the profile of a woman terrorized by ghosts, driven by medium-delivered instructions, building compulsively to forestall death. What it matches is a wealthy widow who valued control over her domestic environment and found satisfaction in continuous architectural revision, a project that only extreme wealth and absence of social obligations could sustain indefinitely. The house was her work, her occupation, her daily engagement with material reality. It gave her life structure, purpose, and creative outlet. That these motivations seem insufficient to later interpreters reveals more about cultural attitudes toward women's autonomy and creativity than about Sarah Winchester's actual psychology. The Easy Riser staircase appears in the myth cycle as one of many fabricated 13s, though it has 44 steps, not 13, and was built for mobility rather than magical purposes. Tour guides learn to count windows in groups of 13, to emphasize 13-panel ceilings, to note 13 hooks in a closet, a numerological game played across a house containing thousands of architectural features. Given enough windows, enough panels, enough hooks, enough rooms, any number will recur multiple times through simple statistical inevitability. Significance is found by those looking for patterns, and tourists, having paid admission and driven to San Jose specifically to see the Mystery House, deserve the patterns they came expecting. By the 1970s, the Mystery House brand was firmly established. Scholarly attempts to correct the record appeared in academic journals and preservation reports, reaching audiences of hundreds. Popular culture's ghost-haunted version reached millions through television, film, books, and word of mouth. The house that Sarah built to accommodate her body and satisfy her design interests had become the house that ghosts built, one haunted night at a time, through construction supervised by the dead. April 18, 1906, at 5:12 a.m., the San Andreas Fault slipped along 300 miles of California coast. The earthquake that destroyed much of San Francisco, killed thousands, and redrew the map of urban California, reached south to San Jose with enough force to collapse chimneys, crack foundations, and bring down the tallest portions of Lanata Villa. The 7-story tower that had defined the mansion's silhouette fell story by story, timber framing splintering as floors pancaked downward under their own weight and the weight of everything above. Staff would later recall the sound, first a roar like approaching freight trains, then the percussion of successive collapses as each floor struck the one below, then the relative silence filled with dust settling and small sounds of materials finding new equilibrium. Sarah survived uninjured, though some accounts claim she was briefly trapped in a bedroom when a chimney fell across the doorway before servants cleared the rubble. The ballroom's northern wall cracked diagonally from ceiling to floor, a fracture that would remain visible for decades despite repair attempts. Plaster ornaments throughout the house shattered, their fragments scattered across Persian carpets and parquet floors. Art glass windows, surprisingly, mostly held, testament to careful installation in flexible frames that allowed the glass to shift without shattering, and to the quality of lead camming that bound the pieces together with materials designed to accommodate movement. But the structural damage was severe enough that Sarah made an immediate decision. She would not rebuild the tallest sections. The mansion that had climbed 7 stories toward the valley sky would be capped at 4, its upper reaches sealed behind boarded windows and locked doors. This wasn't superstition or supernatural instruction, it was practical engineering assessment. The tallest sections had proven most vulnerable. Rebuilding them would require massive expense for portions of the house she rarely used. Better to consolidate, to inhabit the lower, more stable sections, to accept the earthquake's architectural editing. Photographs from the weeks following the earthquake show scaffolding against surviving walls, work crews hauling debris in wheelbarrows, tarpaulins protecting damaged roofs from spring rains. Insurance payouts and personal funds covered repairs, But Sarah's instructions were clear. Restore what remained, abandon what fell, make the house habitable rather than attempting to resurrect its most extravagant elements. The result? Doors that once accessed upper tower floors now opened to nothing, their thresholds becoming the literal drops that tour guides later called mysteries. Windows that looked into tower stairwells now looked into sealed voids where sunlight never reached. The earthquake edited the house with geological finality, imposing an endpoint that human intention had never established. The easy riser staircase survived intact, its low profile and deeply embedded construction proving more resilient than taller, more dramatic elements. Its shallow steps, spreading lateral forces across more framing members and more wall surface, handled the shaking better than steeper conventional stairs elsewhere in the house. Sarah continued using it, climbing to the second floor of remaining sections, her routine barely altered. The stairs had been designed to spare her joints. Now they proved they could spare themselves, their humane proportions accidentally creating structural advantage. But elsewhere, whole wings stood empty, too damaged to occupy comfortably, too expensive to fully restore, given that Sarah lived alone with minimal staff. For the first time in 2 decades, construction contracted rather than expanded. Rooms were closed off, furniture moved to undamaged areas, entire sections of the house effectively mothballed. The earthquake succeeded where no architectural plan had. It imposed a conclusion, a forced endpoint. The house stopped growing not because Sarah chose to stop, but because the earth itself, moving along ancient fault lines, said enough. The years between the earthquake and Sarah Winchester's death in 1922 settled into quieter rhythms stripped of architectural ambition. Tax records and maintenance invoices document ongoing repairs, roof replacements as shingles weathered and leaked, plumbing updates as fixtures aged and joints corroded, garden care as trees matured and required pruning, but no major new construction. The building permits that had appeared regularly in county records through the 1890s and early 1900s ceased almost entirely. What had been an active construction site became simply a large, aging house requiring maintenance. Sarah divided her time between the San Jose property and houses she owned in Atherton and Palo Alto, sometimes lending the San Jose mansion to relatives who stayed in its less damaged sections while she resided elsewhere. The vast structure entered a period of semi-occupancy, some rooms in daily use, others boarded, and gradually accumulating the dust that settles on any unused space. Furniture remained in place under sheets, carpets stayed rolled in corners. The house existed in a state between full life and abandonment, neither entirely lived in nor entirely vacant. The easy riser staircase wore smooth along the center of each tread, the mahogany darkening where hands gripped the handrail daily. The polish of human use replacing the polish of application, organic oils from skin gradually changing the wood surface character. The shallow steps that once served an endless project now served only the reduced needs of an aging woman moving through fewer and fewer rooms. Servants kept curtains drawn in unused sections, protecting fabrics from sun damage, but giving those spaces the feel of perpetual twilight. The ballroom, its earthquake crack repaired but still visible as a faint line in the plaster, stood silent except during occasional cleaning, a monument to parties never held, to society never courted, to possibilities never realized. Gardens that had once sprawled across acres, employing full-time groundskeepers, maintaining elaborate flower beds and fruit orchards, contracted to more manageable plots near the house's main entrance. Some orchard trees died and weren't replaced, others were removed to reduce maintenance burden. The property began its slow reversion from showcase estate to ordinary large house, its ambitions receding with its aging owner. Photographs from this period show a house settling into itself, paint weathering on sealed tower sections, ivy claiming portions of brick foundation, shutters hanging slightly askew on upper windows no one opened anymore. What had been meticulously maintained as a display of vitality and continuous transformation began displaying the ordinary entropy of large, aging structures. Roof leaks appeared in unheated rooms, staining ceilings and warping floorboards. Wallpaper curled at edges where moisture penetrated walls. The intricate systems of bells and speaking tubes fell out of use as the household staff shrank to a skeleton crew, maintaining only occupied areas. This decline lacked drama. No scandal precipitated it, no financial collapse forced it, no tragic event accelerated it, simply the natural retreat that comes when ambition exhausts itself and age imposes limitations. Sarah herself, now in her 70s and then 80s, moved with the care that had always justified her shallow stairs, but now characterized all movement. The house had always been shaped to her body. Now both body and house moved toward stillness together, partners in the gradual wind-down that precedes ending. Visitors who saw the property in these years described it as eccentric but melancholy, a vast shell whose purposes had faded with the woman who created it. The mansion felt less like an active residence than like a museum to which only one person held a key, wandering rooms filled with memories of construction rather than memories of conventional domestic life, family gatherings, celebrations, the social rituals that typically filled houses of such scale. By 1920, the Winchester Mystery House existed more vividly in newspaper archives and collective memory than in physical fact. The articles from the 1890s lingered, their supernatural speculations repeated in new feature stories whenever reporters needed California oddity content. But the house itself was withdrawing from public consciousness, becoming less an active curiosity and more a simple, oversized estate, awaiting the inevitable transition that comes when elderly owners die and heirs must decide what to do with monuments built for intensely personal purposes that cannot transfer to other owners. Sarah Lockwood Winchester died on September 5, 1922, at age 82 in her Palo Alto residence, leaving behind approximately $20 million in assets, primarily Winchester Repeating Arms Company stock and accumulated dividends, along with real estate holdings scattered across the Bay Area, but a house that probate records described as having no clear monetary value due to its eccentricity and condition. Real estate assessors hired by the estate walked through 160 rooms finding magnificent woodwork and art glass alongside architectural dead ends, earthquake damage never fully repaired, and a floor plan so irregular that converting it to any conventional use seemed impossible at any reasonable cost. Who would buy a mansion designed for one woman's private needs and continuous revision, now damaged and partially sealed, requiring enormous maintenance expense, but offering no obvious function? Hotels needed regular floor plans and conventional room counts. Institutions needed adaptable spaces. Residential buyers needed something that made sense for family life. The Winchester house offered none of these. It was magnificently unique, which in real estate terms translated to magnificently unsaleable. The auction came quickly. Furniture, pianos, carpets, art glass panels never installed, decorative hardware, curtains, even doorknobs, everything removable, went to the highest bidder in a series of sales that dismembered the house's interior. Men carried pieces down the easy riser staircase to waiting wagons, the shallow steps now serving the house's dismemberment rather than its daily life or its construction. What had taken decades to acquire dispersed in weeks. Buyers haggled over carved mahogany panels, over German chandeliers, over lengths of Persian carpet that had insulated ballroom floors. The Winchester estate retained the land and remaining orchards, which had clear agricultural value that could be sold separately. But the house itself stood nearly empty, stripped of furnishings, its carved panels and ornate ceilings echoing in rooms, no longer softened by carpets, curtains, and the accumulated objects of daily life. For more than a year, the structure sat unsold, too large for any family, too eccentric for conversion to commercial use, too expensive to maintain for any buyer without specific plans and significant capital. Maintenance costs mounted, roofs needed repair, broken windows needed replacement, grounds needed basic care to prevent complete deterioration. Weather entered through damaged sections. Vandals broke a few windows. Neighborhood children invented stories about ghosts and dared each other to approach the property after dark. Local newspapers ran occasional pieces about the White Elephant estate, speculating whether it would eventually be demolished for salvage value, the lumber and fixtures worth more separately than the building was worth whole. Then, in 1923, a group of investors recognized what estate assessors had not. The house's commercial value lay precisely in its strangeness. Tourist attractions didn't need to be conventionally beautiful or practically functional. They needed to be memorable, to offer experiences unavailable elsewhere, to generate word-of-mouth enthusiasm. The Winchester House, with its architectural oddities accumulated through decades of continuous construction, its reclusive creator who never explained herself, its newspaper-fueled rumors of supernatural motivation, was nothing if not memorable. It was weird enough to attract curiosity, large enough to accommodate tour groups, and close enough to San Francisco to draw urban tourists seeking day trips. John and Mamie Brown, along with business partners, purchased the property and immediately began transforming it from private residence into public mystery. Their vision was clear. Market the weirdness, emphasize the ghost stories, create scripted tours that turned architectural peculiarities into evidence of supernatural obsession. Within months, they had developed tour routes, hired guides, created promotional materials, and established the Winchester Mystery House brand that would define the property for the next century. The house opened for tours in 1923, barely a year after Sarah Winchester's death. Brochures emphasized every anomaly, every sealed door, every stair to nowhere. The narrative solidified rapidly. A woman building ceaselessly to appease gun-violent spirits, a mansion haunted by design, a monument to guilt and supernatural terror. Sarah Winchester's actual biography, rational, financially competent, architecturally ambitious, simply very private, became collateral damage to the story tourists wanted and operators needed to sell. The house she built to escape public scrutiny became California's most scrutinized house, its meanings forever written by strangers selling tickets to other strangers. The transformation into tourist attraction required both preservation and fabrication, a combination that would define the property's existence for decades. Tour routes needed to be established through a house designed without any consideration for guided groups. Some doors were propped permanently open to create circulation flow. Others were sealed to prevent tourists from wandering into unsafe or irrelevant areas. Staircases were roped off where steps had deteriorated or where traffic would cause excessive wear. Rooms were staged with period furniture, not Sarah's original pieces, which had dispersed through auction, but similar Victorian items acquired to suggest authenticity without claiming it. The Easy Riser staircase became a mandatory highlight. Guides paused there to let groups examine the shallow treads, to explain its 44 steps, gaining barely 10 feet of elevation, to suggest, incorrectly, that the number held mystical significance in numerology or spiritualist practice. The actual explanation, arthritis accommodation, humane design, practical accessibility, appeared in some early tours, but gradually disappeared as operators realized that medical explanations disappointed visitors expecting supernatural revelation. Tourists photographed the stairs, touched the worn handrails, counted the steps themselves to verify the magical number. Mamie Brown, in particular, shaped the early narrative with entrepreneurial creativity unrestricted by documentary evidence. She'd purchased personal items at the estate auction and constructed origin stories around them. This was Sarah's bedroom, where she consulted with spirits. This was the seance room, where mediums delivered instructions. This was the hallway, where ghostly footsteps echoed. Neighbors who remembered Sarah as practical and clear-headed objected publicly to these inventions. Letters to the San Jose Mercury News through the 1920s and 30s protested the supernatural embellishments attached to a woman who had simply been private and wealthy. The objections made no commercial difference. The Mystery House was never about accuracy. It was about performance, about delivering the experience tourists had paid to receive. By the 1930s, the house had settled into its new identity as Depression-era entertainment. Admission was affordable, the tour was elaborate enough to justify the price, and the combination of genuine architectural oddity with manufactured mystery proved irresistible. Families drove from San Francisco for weekend outings. Schoolchildren came on field trips. Couples made it a date destination. The supernatural narrative, amplified through repetition, achieved cultural solidity. Guides who initially improvised stories solidified them into scripts that new guides memorized. The spiderweb window became a spirit communication device. The number 13 gained significance in every room where it could be counted. Trapdoors in the garden floor were recast as paranormal apparatus rather than drainage engineering. Every architectural choice, every design revision, every remnant of earthquake damage received supernatural explanation. The easy riser staircase became evidence that Sarah feared rapid ascent to second floors, to heaven, to judgment. Doors opening to walls became evidence of deliberate confusion tactics against pursuing ghosts. Windows facing interior walls became proof of paranoid construction, meant to deceive spirits who navigated by light and views. The house's actual history: wealthy widow, genuine architectural innovation, continuous building as creative occupation, earthquake damage creating unintended consequences, disappeared beneath layers of scripted fabrication. The house that Sarah Winchester built as a refuge from grief and public scrutiny became exactly what she might have most dreaded: a stage where strangers performed her life as Gothic spectacle several times daily, where her privacy was violated by hundreds of visitors weekly, where her architectural agency and creative vision were erased in favor of ghost story passivity in which spirits and mediums drove every decision. The irony was absolute. She had built to control space, to shape her environment according to her needs and aesthetic desires. In death, she controlled nothing. The house spoke with voices not her own, telling stories she never authorized, serving purposes she never intended. Yet, preservation resulted. Had the property been demolished for agricultural land, a realistic possibility in 1923, when no conventional buyers emerged, nothing physical would remain of Sarah Winchester's decades-long architectural project, except scattered furniture in antique shops and a few photographs in archives. The decision to commercialize, however exploitative and historically inaccurate, ensured the building's survival through economic self-interest. Tour revenue paid for maintenance, for repairs, for keeping the structure intact through decades when similar Victorian mansions were bulldozed for subdivisions. The price was meaning, accuracy, respect for the actual woman who built it. But perhaps meaning in architecture is always unstable, always subject to revision by those who inherit and inhabit spaces others built for purposes that cannot fully transfer. By the 1970s, scholarly attention began displacing tourist mythology, though the process was gradual, incomplete, and constantly negotiating with commercial interests that preferred profitable legend to complex truth. The California Office of Historic Preservation designated the property California Historical Landmark No. 868, describing it formally as a 160-room Victorian mansion, continuously constructed from 1884 to 1922 by Sarah L. Winchester, heiress to the Winchester rifle fortune. The language was deliberately neutral, documentary, carefully stripped of supernatural narrative. The National Register of Historic Places listing followed in 1974, accompanied by Historic American Buildings Survey documentation, measured drawings executed by architectural historians, archival photographs capturing every room and architectural detail, analytical reports that explained anomalies through construction history and earthquake damage rather than spiritualism or obsession. General Manager Keith Kittle oversaw significant renovations and interpretive updates during this period, attempting to balance commercial demands that still relied on mystery and supernatural appeal with emerging historical consciousness that valued accuracy and documentary rigor. New brochures began acknowledging that some stories were legends rather than documented facts, though these disclaimers often appeared in small print or secondary materials, while primary marketing continued emphasizing ghosts and spirits. Tours started mentioning Sarah Winchester's arthritis when discussing the easy riser staircase, framing it as an accessibility innovation rather than a cult design, though guides often presented this as alternative interpretation rather than documentary fact, allowing visitors to choose their preferred narrative. Preservation work stabilized long-neglected earthquake damage, restored deteriorated finishes using historically appropriate materials and techniques, and documented construction methods for future study and ongoing maintenance. Structural engineers assessed foundations, framing, and load-bearing walls. Conservators analyzed paint layers and wallpaper to understand original color schemes. Architectural historians examined construction details to trace the building's evolution through decades of episodic expansion. The house was being systematically understood, perhaps for the first time, as an architectural document rather than simply a tourist attraction. The Habs documentation proved particularly valuable for this scholarly reappraisal. Black and white photographs capturing every room, every stairway, every architectural detail without the distortion of tour lighting or supernatural suggestion. Floor plans showing the house's true complexity as a palimpsest of construction phases rather than a deliberate maze. Elevation drawings revealing how Victorian, Gothic, and Romanesque elements merged without master coordination, but with consistent attention to proportion and detail. The easy riser staircase appeared in these surveys as measured data, 44 steps, each approximately 4 inches tall, rising a total of approximately 10 feet over a horizontal span of roughly 30 feet, constructed of mahogany with hand-turned balusters and a continuous handrail. The photographs captured worn treads where a century of feet had polished the wood smooth along a narrow central band, the practical beauty of joinery shaped to make climbing easier for a body in pain. What the documentation couldn't fully capture was the cultural negotiation happening in real time. Scholarly attempts to correct the record colliding with tourism industry investment in mystery and supernatural narrative that had defined the property's commercial identity for half a century. Academic papers published in preservation, journals and historical society publications reached audiences of hundreds, professionals, scholars, local historians. Ghost hunting television shows featuring the Winchester house as prime evidence of supernatural activity reached audiences of millions, cementing its reputation as America's most haunted mansion, despite complete absence of documentary evidence for hauntings beyond tourist testimony shaped by expectation and suggestion. Mary Jo Ignafo's carefully researched biography of Sarah Winchester, published in 2010 as Captive of the Labyrinth, offered the most thorough documentary corrections to decades of accumulated myth. Based on years of archival research, probate records, business correspondence, legal documents, contemporary newspaper coverage, family letters, Ignafo reconstructed Sarah's actual biography. A wealthy, intelligent woman exercising architectural agency, managing substantial investments competently, living privately by choice rather than supernatural compulsion. The book received respectful reviews, won preservation awards, and influenced scholarly understanding. Horror films, paranormal investigation shows, and Halloween tourism packages ignored it entirely, continuing to present the medium-commanded ghost house narrative as fact. The house itself remained architecturally neutral through all these interpretive battles, as buildings always are. Morning light still filtered through art glass windows, refracting into spectrum colors that shifted across walls according to season and time of day. The ballroom's carved paneling still bore chisel marks from long-dead artisans, evidence of human labor translated into permanent form. The easy riser staircase still rose in shallow increments, serving no one now but calibrated forever to the body that commissioned it, a monument less to fear than to the simple desire for independence, for the ability to climb stairs without pain, to move through a house without assistance. In preservation's technical language, the mansion became a contributing structure within its historic district designation, possessing character-defining features requiring protection: the art glass, the carved wood, the irregular floor plan, the earthquake-altered sections. The passion and grief and architectural ambition that generated these features survived only as measurements and material descriptions, square footage and room counts, elevation drawings and landmark plaques, necessary simplifications that made the house legible to bureaucratic and legal systems designed to protect historic resources, but perhaps unable to fully honor the human complexity that created them. The Winchester Mystery House opens daily year-round, offering multiple tour options calibrated to different interests and comfort levels. Architectural tours emphasizing construction history and Victorian design, historical tours attempting documentary accuracy, seasonal Halloween extravaganzas leaning into supernatural. narratives and behind-the-scenes tours accessing normally closed areas. Visitors arrive from everywhere. Families on California vacations seeking educational entertainment, architecture students sketching Victorian details for coursework, paranormal enthusiasts hoping for genuine supernatural encounters, historians checking documented facts against commercial narratives, curious travelers who heard about the weird house and want to see for themselves. The house serves all these purposes simultaneously, accommodating contradictory interpretations, never quite reconciling scholarly accuracy with commercial mythology, but managing to preserve the physical structure while various meanings compete for dominance. In the gift shop, scholarly books about Sarah Winchester's actual life, including Mary Jo Ignafo's biography and architectural studies published by preservation organizations, share shelf space with ghost hunting equipment, Ouija boards, and paranormal investigation guides marketed to visitors seeking supernatural experience rather than historical education. The Easy Riser staircase remains a mandatory tour stop, roped off now for preservation or carefully supervised to prevent excessive wear, its treads worn smooth by more than a century of ascending feet. First Sarah's hesitant climb, then servants and relatives, then auctioneers and investors, then decades of tourists running hands along the same mahogany rail she gripped daily. Morning tour groups pause there, while guides explain, some emphasizing accessibility and medical need, with references to arthritis and Victorian-era mobility challenges, others still suggesting supernatural significance with references to numerology and spirit appeasement, the narrative depending on which script individual guides follow, which audience demographics they're addressing, and which interpretive philosophy currently shapes employee training. The 44 steps rise as they always have, exactly as Sarah Winchester specified more than a century ago, when she needed a way to climb between floors that her arthritic joints could tolerate and her wealth could commission without constraint. The stairs have become what architectural features become when buildings survive into new eras, simultaneously historical artifacts, tourist attractions, and blank surfaces onto which visitors project their own interests and interpretations. Recent years have brought modest but meaningful corrections to dominant public narratives. The official website now acknowledges that the Boston Medium story lacks any documentary verification, noting that no evidence supports the seance narrative despite decades of repetition. Brochures mention Sarah's documented financial acumen, her role as successful investor managing substantial wealth, her rational business correspondence. Tour guides receive training modules covering both the architectural history and the mythology, learning to distinguish documented fact from profitable legend. Though market research consistently shows that visitors still express higher satisfaction ratings for tours, emphasizing ghost stories over building permits and construction history. The house has become intellectually layered, historical fact buried beneath accumulated commercial narrative, with ongoing preservation efforts attempting to excavate authentic history without destroying the profitable mystery that funds conservation work and pays for structural maintenance. It's an uneasy compromise between scholarship and commerce, between respect for Sarah Winchester's actual life and continuation of interpretations she would likely have found horrifying, between architectural preservation and narrative exploitation. What remains most tangibly consistent across all interpretations are the physical facts. The carved wood in the ballroom still catches light in patterns of Victorian-era artisan intricacy, demonstrating craft traditions that connected 19th-century California to European woodworking heritage. The art glass windows still fracture California sunshine into spectrum colors, their lead-caming and hand-cut pieces representing collaborative work between designers, glassworkers, and installers. The indoor garden's trapdoors still open onto brick drainage channels, elegant solutions to moisture management demonstrating that practical engineering and architectural beauty need not conflict. The house is still materially here, which represents its own remarkable achievement. So many Gilded Age mansions have been demolished entirely, victims of changing tastes, property taxes, maintenance costs, urban development pressures, or simple family decisions that architecture built for one generation need not survive to burden the next. This one survives because commercialization made preservation profitable, because supernatural narratives attracted revenue that funded maintenance, because the decision to market the mystery ultimately protected the physical structure even while distorting its meaning. On quiet mornings before tour groups arrive and before the gift shop opens, the house holds something approaching its original silence. Light moves across walls Sarah Winchester selected, through rooms she designed according to preferences now lost, down corridors she commissioned for purposes that seemed clear then, but remain ambiguous now. The easy riser staircase stands perpetually ready, 44 shallow steps that will never again serve their original purpose of allowing an arthritic widow to climb independently between floors, but which remain as permanent evidence that architecture, at its most personal and humane, concerns bodies moving through space and the ways that wealth and will can reshape space to accommodate the specific geometry, needs, and limitations of individual mortal frames. The house remembers nothing. Buildings never do. They lack consciousness, intention, memory in any meaningful sense, but they hold and preserve physical evidence of what was intended, what was built, what survived original construction and subsequent alterations, and what has been rewritten by later inhabitants and interpreters. In that physical evidence, if we attend carefully and examine critically, we can separate the life actually lived from the stories later told about it, can distinguish documented architectural history from profitable supernatural narrative, and can recover at least fragments of the actual human complexity that commercial simplification inevitably erases. The staircase rises, the light shifts, the house stands. Everything else is interpretation, necessary but always incomplete, useful but never final.